Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the Time Horizons podcast.
Today, we're super excited to be having a conversation with Sam Kriegman, who's a postdoctoral associate at the University of Vermont. His research focuses on AI-driven automated design of robots and biological machines. This involves the dynamical simulation of soft body systems, simulation to reality transfer of physical artifacts, and designing the form of functional systems that have limited neural control or none at all. Sam also organizes the Virtual Creatures competition, has co-authored 18 peer-reviewed publications, and co-manages the open source soft robot kit, Voxcraft. Welcome, Sam.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So we wanted to jump right into some of the work that you're doing. I guess at a high level, how would you describe the motivation and focus of your research, and what is the goal? And maybe just at a brief level, what is your research?
That's a great question. So I guess at the highest level, I'm interested in reducing human design bias in the entire engineering and sometimes even scientific processes. So the engineering process of designing and manufacturing robots, how can we just automate that entire thing? Now, there's good reason to do that because these processes are based on human intuition, but human intuition is not so great. I mean, we've designed and built incredibly complex and incredibly useful machines, but we have limited intuition when it comes to things that we've never experienced, like the nanoscale or machines that are going to operate in space. When humans are limited in how they can kind of imagine the processes that unfold in these environments, I think it would be nice, perhaps, if not entirely, to let AIs design those machines, to collaborate with AIs, design those kinds of new and hopefully useful machines.
For sure. And I guess if you were to, describe what exactly, I think a lot of your work, at least from what we've seen, is around something known as virtual creatures. What are virtual creatures? And then what are the potential applications that this type of work can have?
So virtual creatures means different things to different people. For me, it is any kind of simulated robot, which means that there's probably going to be physics approximated in the computer in a digital form. So this is typically classical mechanics. There's not like warping of space-time or quantum mechanics in there. But that said, if you wanted to design a system in a simulator and then build it in reality and expect its behavior to transfer from simulation to reality, in most cases, you need to be simulating the kinds of dynamics you expect to occur in the real system. So if we wanted a robot to exist in the quantum realm, then we might actually need to simulate those kinds of factors. But for most of my work, it's not that small and not that big or fast. So it's normally around the micron scale in the case of the xenobots, which we'll talk about later, I'm sure, up to the kind of intermediate scales of like a robot that would interact with humans.
And what is, I guess, the application of that towards potentially healthcare or climate or whatever it is in industry that these virtual creatures could have right now, or that you're aiming towards hitting, I guess?
So if you can accurately simulate things, if things do transfer from simulation to reality, then you have this amazing test bed for design. You can test, depending on how much computational resources you have. I'm lucky enough to have access to a cluster with 100 GPUs and a lot of CPUs. So we can simulate thousands of robots at once. And over the course of a month, billions of designs, of potential designs. Some of them might just be incredibly terrible designs that you'd never want to build in reality. And it's better to build them or to not build them and just to simulate them first, to just throw away these potentially dangerous designs, the ones that just don't perform so well. So it gives you, I guess, a way to perform this pre-selection in the design before you actually build them.
Yeah, and I know you had one of these, a piece in Nature Digital Medicine around why virtual creatures matter, and in that you kind of commented on how there was it started off in the 90s, and then sort of evolved through different researchers to the 2000s, but there was some bottleneck between the 2000s to 2013. What was that bottleneck, and then what changed as a result of some of the work recently that has allowed to some recent advances in this space as well?
Yeah, we should take a step back and talk about the history of virtual creatures. So it started in the early 90s, and this is when there were no physics engines. You couldn't go online and download like Bullet or PyBullet or OD, these popular physics engines that exist now. So if you wanted to simulate a robot, or it turns out that this is the best way to animate creatures to make them look physically realistic, it's to simulate the physics instead of trying to draw exactly where an animal might move its limbs as it was moving. So the best way to do that is to simulate physics, but there were no physics engines back in the early 90s. So you had a lot of work coming out of the MIT Media Lab and what's the name of this company that Danny Hillis and Carl Sims worked at. I can't believe I'm forgetting this, but it's okay. I'll Google it in a second. So you had this work basically coming out of MIT, and it was Carl Sims and Jeffrey Ventrella, and a couple of people had these similar ideas at the same time, which were like, we can simulate these animated characters. Why don't we simulate an evolutionary process, like a Darwinian process entirely inside of the computer, and see what kinds of forms come out? We can say what the fitness function is. Let's just get creatures that are really good at swimming, that are good at following a light, fighting with each other, jumping really high, etc. And so from that, you got just incredibly inspiring, it's still to this day, animations. That was the inspiration for my own work. And arguably, no virtual creatures have been any better than the ones that were first created in like 1993. So there is this bottleneck, or some kind of stagnation in the field. And the question, which I think is really interesting, is why. And we see all this incredible improvement in like image recognition. Why are we not seeing this improvement in simulated and real robots? What's different about embodied systems, whether they're simulated or in reality, that is hindering the progress?
Yeah, so also like just kind of going over like the areas that there are involved in this. As far as I can tell, like there's four main ones, right? There's the actual morphology of the creatures being designed. There's the simulation of those creatures, which is what you were talking about, doing on like the massive cluster. There's the transfer to reality, and then there's the actual control of these things. And they're kind of disparate areas, but you need all of them to kind of work in tandem to have a full system. So like, what do you think is the relationship between those areas? And then where's like progress has happened sufficiently, and where do we need more going forward? And how does your work fit into that?
Yeah, sorry. As you were talking, I couldn't help myself. I had to Google what the name of that company was. It was Thinking Machines Corporation.
Okay.
So this is a company that made super parallelized computers before they were popular today. They were kind of ahead of their time. So while I was doing that, I missed the three things that you asked me in your question to relate. Could you repeat those?
Sorry. Yeah. So like there seems to be like four different areas, I guess.
Okay.
Of like research, right? Which is morphology, like what are the right morphologies, simulation of different morphologies, and different like virtual creatures, sim to real transfer. So how well can those actual like those things in simulation transfer to reality, and then the control. And then what's the relationship between those areas, and why have you decided to like focus on this morphology aspect?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for robots, it's often really useful to make this distinction between control and morphology.
Yeah.
I mean, in animals, this distinction arguably doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Everything's physical. Everything is, you could think about things happening in an animal that is like software and is like hardware. but in the end, it's all a metaphor and it's all some physical thing. In robots, it is obviously really useful to make this distinction between software and hardware because we have electronics. But in a lot of robots, especially at the micro scale, we don't have a way yet of kind of programming these things with traditional electronics and software. So for these kinds of things, it can be really useful if you can program them in other ways, which can be through their morphology. So robots, if they're shaped properly, don't need an intelligent controller to do the job correctly. If they have the right morphology for a task, then they can kind of just stochastically move around and still do useful work. So there's a lot of area, I think, that's underexplored in morphological design. That's not to say one deserves more attention than others. It's just less attention has been paid, I think, to the morphology of robots, which is why I've focused on it. But they're all tightly intertwined, and they're obviously intertwined with their environment, which is why simulation is really important. And as you said, simulation to reality transfer.
Yeah.
If you plan on making robots, then you have. It's crucial to ground the simulation in something that's actually manufacturable. And this is the hardest part, arguably. It's really easy to make a simulation of something that moves however you want it to move. But to actually transfer it from simulation to reality is a huge challenge. People have been working on this problem since the 90s. It seems like everything was done in the 90s. At Sussex University, there was this group, in particular, Nick Jacoby was interested in the simulation to reality gap. He called it the reality gap.
Yeah. And
he found that, at least for transferring controllers from basically like Roomba robots to like hockey pucks with little wheels, the Kepera robot, he could transfer controllers for these really simple robots from simulation to reality by just randomizing things in the simulation to prevent the controllers from overfitting. And this has become like very popular now. And
like the domain randomization.
Yeah, domain randomization. It's definitely been rebranded and like now it's on like steroids and like pumped up, and it's way better than probably what it used to be in the 90s. That works really well. Maybe that's all we need. It's just like, don't let it overfit. But there's probably more sophisticated methods, and there's a whole research field of just simulation reality transfer, I think.
So I would encourage everyone to like look up some of the work or like presentations that Sam has given if you're watching this, like because we obviously don't have any images shown on a podcast. But one of the things that, if you look at Sam's work, that's very striking is like everything's made of these like voxels, and there's like two different colors of voxels, one of which is kind of stationary material and one of which expands and contracts. So I'm curious, Sam, what is the reason for the voxel as the way of representing morphology? Because the original virtual creatures, they weren't like that. So like why have you made that evolution towards voxels? And what makes that easier, either computationally or whether it's just produces better designs?
Yeah, there's kind of an evolution of the software itself.
Yeah.
You know, there are things that were just available to me at the time. And I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so I used it. I think that's really the reason, is that there was the software available, it used voxels, and it looked good enough for me, so I used it. Mm-hmm. That being said, I mean, we could come up with arguments of why voxels might be better than other things.
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessary. Voxels are cool. It's like Minecraft. It's like building with Legos. I really like the design space of cubes. Mm-hmm. Actually, there was an article that came out that said everything's literally a cube, and there's like mathematics to prove that like everything is some kind of like a whatever. So maybe we are all voxels, but in any case, it's cool to think about from a design perspective. You can enumerate all the possible designs you can make with two cubes. There's only one design. You stick them together, it's a column. Mm-hmm. You can rotate it up so it's a column, or lying down on the ground so it's like a row. I would call that one design. Whatever, you could have three cubes and you can make a straight thing or a right angle. you could have 4, and then you have all the Tetris pieces, and you also have like 2 more that stick out of plane. You'd have 5, 6, 7. Once you get to like even 9 or 10, you already have billions of possible designs. It's such a
Yeah.
simple, uh, building block, and seemingly so few parts.
Yeah.
You already have this enormous design space, which
Yeah.
I think is really powerful to just think about how we're searching the space, to be able to enumerate it. I really like that there's this like mathematical underpinning. If you start to have like particles that are free flowing, there's like infinitely many possible designs you can make. I can't like conceptualize moving particles like free form in space. I know that there are perfectly good reasons to use like
It's almost like it's like the fundamental thing we all started building with, like as a kid, like
yeah.
Lego, or even those little blocks that like you're at like your kitchen table, whatever it was, playing with. I was wondering, like, why, how does this come now back into, so it's, I recognize it's really good for design, but why does this work for biology now? And like what, like how did you even get, it seems very like, how did you get into bio through this journey as well? And why, how does voxels fit into this bio space? I know there's like two very separate questions. So maybe we'll focus first on why voxels work with biology first.
Yeah, so the voxels are simulated as like squishy voxels. It could be rigid ones like Legos. In this case, it's a really simple way to simulate soft material. And if you want to simulate biological systems or biological building material, for the most part, it's soft. You have bone and stuff, but um, soft body dynamics and soft robotics is kind of like an unfortunate name. Again,
Mhm.
like a historical thing is that most robots were titanium or metal or hard plastic. So to differentiate themselves, they have to say, this is soft robots. But soft robots can have a range of material stiffness. You could have a soft robot that has parts in it that are titanium, but also super soft. To me, I want rigid-bodied roboticists to have to say, "Oh, well, these are just rigid-bodied robotics," and then soft roboticists can say, "Yeah, this is like more general."
Yeah.
But yeah. So I think just like a tiny bit of details, the voxels can be simulated in a bunch of different ways. You can have like springs, basically springs on the outside, on the edges of all the voxels. But the way that we do it is each pair of voxels is simulated by this like beam that's stretchable and twistable and bendable. So the voxels actually are like a mesh that's on it just to visualize.
Yeah.
But really what you're looking at is like a beam mass lattice, which
Mhm.
itself is squishable, deformable, and everything else.
So just like I think so everyone's aware. So when you say like these are squishable, but they also are able to exert some force in and out and expand and contract, right? And just to be clear, like that force is completely independent between different, like, so if you've got a voxel on one side of your organism and then one on the other side of your organism, that both are able to expand or contract, they're doing that kind of at random, right?
Yeah, so it depends on the application. So you can have a voxel in the toe of the robot expand volumetrically, and a voxel in the forehead of the robot, not move at all or expand at its own
Yeah.
rate. So digging down into the details once again, I don't know how fruitful this really is, but if you're simulating these voxels as a beam, you can simulate volumetric expansion and contraction like a piston. So two voxels just expand and contract. There's a
Yeah.
beam attaching their center points. It expands and contracts, and it changes the resting length between them. So there's still all these passive dynamics. You can flick it and it jiggles, but it has its own like beat that it can pulse at. So one of the things that's easy to simulate with voxels is volumetric actuation. If you want a hinge joint or a rotational joint, you can still do it with enough voxels, but it might not be the right kind of tool for you. You might need to program in just a special element in the simulation to allow that. That said, the biology mostly deals with volumetric things. And once you have bones and complicated systems, you can have whatever you want. But the simple robots that I think you're referring to are the xenobots that had heart muscle and skin tissue. And so we simulated these cells or
Yeah.
groups of cells as voxels, and the heart beats, it contracts and relaxes. So that is volumetric contraction and expansion. And touching back on this point about domain randomization, what we did, because we weren't sure how, if you take a bunch of frog heart cells from, basically what happens is it's a very, very early frog embryo. It's like a day old. There's nothing in it. It's all stem cells. There's no neurons. There are ethical considerations, of course, but at this point, it's nothing. That gets disassembled, and there are cells that are fated to become heart cells, and cells that are fated to become skin cells. So they will develop into that eventually. And the heart cells, we know, when it is in the shape of an adult frog heart, they all synchronize. We can predict what they're going to do. But if you take frog heart cells or any species heart cells and you arrange them into a new shape, trying to think of something strange, like a barbell or something, or a car made out of, how are the cells going to synchronize? Are they going to synchronize at all? We weren't sure. So we randomized the contraction and expansion. So we applied dynamics randomization to the heart muscle. And we asked an evolutionary algorithm to position the heart and skin cells into a new organism, its overall shape and the distribution of heart cells within that shape, so that this organism, for example, would just move forward in simulation. It turned out that dynamics randomization was enough to actually transfer this real thing, or this simulated thing made out of voxels, into real heart and skin cells and a little blob that moves across the dish.
Yeah, no. So I think this is where we wanted to kind of get into now, which is kind of I think what's been widely popularized from your work as well, the Xenobot. And for our audience, I'd encourage you to check it out. And for people who like basketball, even Jalen Rose talked about Xenobots on ESPN. And like, I thought that was pretty cool when I saw that as well. And so, I think what you commented on a lot is Xenobots, if I'm summarizing correctly here, it's just a synthetic organism that's going to use, I guess, or it's named, if I'm correct, after the African frog, or the clawed frog. And you're using these, I guess, types of the cells from these African clawed frogs to, I guess, design some type of function. And you design that function by combining these different types of tissues together. But I wanted to make sure I'm not giving the most layman definition. Maybe if you could provide one for our audience, and then we can dig into some of that even more further now as well.
Yeah, totally. I'm so in the weeds that I forget sometimes to explain like what I'm even talking about. Yeah, of course, you stick these cells together and it makes a living robot. That's just like become normal to me. But I realize that is a strange concept to most people, and was to me a year and a half ago. What happened was we were doing these simulations with virtual creatures, and I was showing them to our biologist colleagues, Douglas Blackiston in particular at Tufts University. And Doug said, I can build that. And I told him about the simulation to reality gap problem. And I said, okay, maybe, but this is this huge, major unsolved problem in robotics. Like it would be incredible if we could if we could design machines entirely in simulation and then transfer them to reality, but we just can't do it yet. And Doug was like, challenge accepted. He built something out of cells that matched one of my virtual creatures. But at that point, it was just kind of a statue. It was it was, I think, a quadruped or something in simulation, and he sculpted a quadruped out of frog cells, and it was just kind of floating there in the dish. And it's incredible because that is like, it's like the size of a grain of sand, a small grain of sand. This is just a speck. And you need to have you need to be like a good athlete to do this. You can't just be smart. You need to have great hand-eye coordination to actually be able to build one of these things. So Doug is a very skilled microsurgeon. So he was able to sculpt out little legs in this instantiation of a virtual creature made out of cells. He took those cells from very early frog embryos, as I was talking about, disassociated them, and you basically get a pile of cells. So instead of a stack of metal and plastic or whatever raw materials you would make a traditional robot out of, maybe silicone if this is a soft robot, you have just cells, thousands of them. If you take these cells and you put them in a little dimple in the petri dish, they naturally, spontaneously compact together and develop. They're not at that point splitting and dividing and growing more cells. For whatever reason, when they're taken from the embryo, part of their developmental program is turned off. They're not going to grow into a frog anymore. They're missing some of the, this is important. They're missing some of the crucial cells. This is just from one spot of the embryo. Yeah. Their orientation, their signals are all messed up. So you have this raw material, it's going to compact together and form, just because of surface tension, a sphere. What you get just by doing that is a sphere, but it's non-functional. It's just a floating sphere. It's alive by all measures of life. It's alive, and it dies after some amount of time, depending on how much like yolk it has stored in it naturally, and the nutrients in the solution, etc. And so Doug took that living sphere, non-functional living sphere, and carved out a shape. That was the genesis of this whole thing. And because we thought, okay, well, how do we transfer function now into this thing?
Yeah.
And we weren't sure, but we turned to this evolutionary process running inside of a simulation, as we talked about before. And we were able, in the end, to design something for a specific behavioral goal. So we tell the system, we tell an AI, a very simple one, we can demystify it, it's not that complicated, but we tell this AI what we want a living system to do. The computers go to work, they spit back a design, and they say, okay, make it have two, in one of the cases, one of our successful designs had two big stumpy muscle legs that pulse. We don't know how, but we know they're pulsing. We don't know like how they're synchronized, and just like a big round chest, and it leaned forward. And in hindsight, this kind of makes sense. Like if you have randomly actuating material, you're going to want like some asymmetrical mass distribution pointing forward, and it worked. So regardless of how its legs were pulsing, it tended to move towards its chest that was angled down. And we had to prove that we actually transferred this to reality. It wasn't just due to random chance. So we ran all kinds of controls, like we turned the organism over on its back in simulation reality. Its legs are up in the air pulsing. It no longer moves. So the computer was able to predict, however coarse-grainedly, that it was how to take living material, reconfigure it into a novel shape and a novel organism, and what its behavior would be. And that was the big breakthrough of this project.
Yeah, I guess it's really amazing, like you were talking about how you take these stem cells, and it just shows you the power of like the morphology as a concept, right? Because it's not developing into a frog. You're making something completely different out of the same basic like building matter. So I guess yeah, it would be great if start off with, if you could talk about like how is that so using an evolutionary algorithm in order to evolve these morphologies that then you go ahead and transfer to real life. So it would be great if you could kind of describe, as you mentioned, how that process works kind of in a bit more detail, and then we can talk about what the challenges are of transferring.
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities with the biological material. You could imagine that this process wouldn't work so well with electronics.
Yeah.
Like you can't just smush together components of a laptop and like hope that it works. You can't disassociate, right? Like your car and smush it together. So there is something special about the morphology of living systems, and we don't exactly know what it is. Our best guess, at least the opinion of our biologist colleagues and myself, is that biological material is different than the kinds of machines we typically build, because there's this like nested competence. That sounds like one of those like meaningless terms that they use to like explain consciousness, but I'll try to make it really more concrete. That if you take apart your laptop, those components themselves have no reason to be able to work on their own. They only work to serve the function of the laptop at the higher order. But if you take apart a frog, you have cells that a billion years ago did have to survive on their own. So organisms are built up of things that at one point in their evolutionary history actually did need to be adaptive in their own right.
Yeah.
And I think that's likely why organisms can be rearranged like this. But of course, that's just a hypothesis. We don't know. So if you have something that's amenable to just being reconfigured like this, or you have an intelligent way to figure out how to adjust a control system for a more traditional robot when searching this morpho space of different designs, then you can use an evolutionary algorithm or whatever you want. The important parts about this algorithm are that it is going to be able to change the body of a system and evaluate how good that change was. Is it worse or better than something else? So a physics engine is really useful there.
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't want to have to build every single one or like carve off something and then say, whoops, like that should be back where it took it off. But specifically, the evolutionary algorithm works like this. You start with a population of random robots or organisms or whatever. These things are randomly configured, and there's no reason to expect that any of them are going to be any good. You can start with a biased population of things you think are going to be good, but again, our intuition is limited. So sometimes it's good just to say, okay, let's start with random. You start with these random ones. They're all going to be terrible, but some are going to be a tiny bit better than others, assuming that they move a little bit. If they're all motionless, okay, maybe you need a better starting point. If you want robots that locomote or that do something physical, some of them are going to be more motile than others to start with. And this gives you kind of like the beginnings of a gradient that evolution can follow. You make mutations to this population of designs. There's lots of ways to do that. The simplest way is just change one thing about them. If they're made of voxels, you can just take away one voxel, add a new one somewhere. You can take two designs, cut them in half and smush them together. That's called recombination or crossover. Then you have a new population of designs. They are modified copies of your original population, or mutants, or offspring. You evaluate all of them. Some of them are better than others. You assign a fitness score, like how far they can move. You delete the bad ones, and you keep the good ones, and you just rinse and repeat. It's the simplest algorithm. Like that, my explanation, this code would be all comments. The actual code is like 3 lines. Make random population, make modified copies, which ones are best, repeat, like loop until you want to stop. That's why I love evolutionary algorithms. There's minimal assumptions and simple.
And so the current way you're implementing this is as this like CPPN, or like a pattern producing network. So basically, if I'm getting this right, from every point in kind of this voxel space, every XYZ position, then it maps to what type of voxel it should be. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there are wrinkles in here. So we did complexify it a little bit because there are things that there are good biases to have. So like I said, you could start with random, you could apply random mutations, but a better way, if you want things that are going to move in space, a good bias to have in the system is regularity. And we use these things called compositional pattern producing networks, or CPPNs.
Yeah.
Say it enough, you might get used to it. CPPNs. They were developed by Ken Stanley, who now I believe is at OpenAI. And they are a special kind of neural network in which the activation functions, or the nodes, can be any kind of function. Typically, they're functions that have regularity and symmetry and repetition, like sine waves or absolute value. They don't have to be differentiable. If you're using an evolutionary algorithm, you don't have to assume the topology of this network if you're using an evolutionary algorithm. Whether or not that's good or bad, I have no idea. But what these networks do is they take as input, as you said, some coordinate space. In our case, you're going to say, I'm going to build a robot inside of this cage that starts at 0, 0, 0, XYZ and increments to, say, 10, 10, 10, XYZ. So a 10 by 10 by 10 cage of potential voxels. And you can query each one in turn, or you can do it all at once, but you query each one and say, is there a voxel at 0, 0, 0? Input 0, 0, 0 to this CPPN, and the output says, yes, there's a voxel. Because the input space is 3D coordinates, the outputs are going to be correlated in physical simulated space.
Yeah.
That creates this regularity. So if you have muscle in the lower left-hand corner voxel, you're more likely to have muscle in the one next to it, which creates patches. Patches and things like repeated motifs in the space. These things tend to be used by biology, so we think that they're useful when we're trying to make new organisms or new kinds of robots, but that is a big assumption that we're putting in there. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case. But this is something that I think is really popular now, having like this meta network design something. You're optimizing a network that builds another network or a robot or a piece of software, or in this case, an organism.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Yeah, because I was wondering what the purpose of using these networks indirectly is, instead of just evolving kind of the voxels themselves. Yeah, that's actually very interesting. So I guess in terms of then how because obviously this evolutionary method, it's not specific to this problem, but you did some like specific adaptations to allow it to transfer to these biological organisms as well, correct?
Yeah, so ideally all of this would be automatic. We would say, make us an organism that's using these kinds of cells. Here's how they behave, or even better, it just has a video camera on like the behavior of these cells and figures it out itself, and it builds a custom simulator. It evolves the machines in there. It outputs a design, and it's directly like 3D printed.
Yeah.
But for now, a lot of those steps were manual.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was manual was tuning the simulator. We started out and we let the simulation have really fine control over the heart muscle, for example, in these cardiac bots that use the heart muscle as motors. And what we got out at the other end was robots that like galloped across the screen in simulation. And we knew that wasn't possible in reality because the heart muscle doesn't have that kind of power. So we knew something was wrong. We knew that the designs and the behaviors that we were seeing in simulation were not going to transfer from reality. We could quantify it so there are paths to automation, but we did this manually. We quantified it by saying how much time in simulation was the simulated creature in contact with the bottom of its dish, which is just surface plane. It was something like 30% of the time. Most of the time it was like hopping off of the floor of the dish. But in reality, the organisms always are touching, they're always dragging their body because they have negative buoyancy, so they sink to the bottom. So we made a bunch of changes in simulation, like random domain dynamics randomization to this cardiac stuff. We added fluid to the world to like slow these things down because it's simulated in an aqueous solution. So we added in some of those forces into simulation. And then this, on the second pass of the evolutionary algorithm, the 100 designs that came out, you could even just see visually that their behavior much better matched what we thought was possible from the real cells. And when we built it, we found out that indeed, at least for a few of the designs, they do transfer to reality.
Yeah. So actually I have another kind of a bit of an orthogonal question, which is like, is it possible with this method to have kind of the more complex control things, or like, is it only really feasible at this point to do these kind of, morphology as the control policy, I guess, in some sense?
Yeah, we don't know what's possible.
Right.
There are all kinds of incredible, whatever you think is not possible in biology probably is. Like, they can control cells by light, something called optogenetics. you could have a remote controlled xenobot organism, whatever, moving in your dish through
Yeah.
light signals or through electricity in the dish. And the way that works is they change the genetics of like the heart muscle, for example, so that when you shine a blue light on it, it will contract and expand. And when you're not shining it, it will just stay put. So you could build like a remote controlled organism from scratch. For me, I'm more interested in autonomous robots and autonomous machines. The question of how you would build a more complicated control system in there, I think would start with adding more cell types besides heart and skin.
Yeah.
You might want some like again, something that's sensitive to light. Maybe there's a way to figure out how to create like phototactic xenobots, ones that follow light, for example. Or I don't know what the limits are of just rearranging cells and when you would need some kind of nervous system in there. I don't know. These are all open questions, but you're right that we're at the moment focusing on like what kinds of things are possible just by shaping the morphology. Like we don't know exactly how these cells are going to interact. Can we channel that behavior? We make it so the environment, I mean, you could shape the environment in some cases, much like a factory's built around, a robot arm. You can do that in the dish. You have a bunch of randomly moving organisms, but you have a canal in the dish, they're all going to fall in the canal. You can do the same kind of thing with morphology. A bunch of randomly moving cells, but they're channeled through a morphology that makes them go straight or makes them carry an object or go in a circle or whatever. How you scale that behavior up, we don't know. That's the next, I think, interesting question. I think something like phototaxis would be a good next step, though.
Yeah, and then like on that question of scaling, so like, is there a plausible pathway to being able to build these types of things at scale, like or more than just at least one person
like
with
Doug.
like a microscope and tweezers? Yeah, like do you know what is there printers available for this sort of thing, or is that just completely uncharted territory?
So right now, it doesn't seem, to the best of my knowledge, that there are bioprinters available with this kind of precision. That said, there's no reason they need to be that small. They could be bigger. You could have people actually work on this problem to try to develop printers for this, and I'm sure that they could. At the moment, they don't exist. There's a couple of paths maybe you could take to automatic manufacture. And like scaling these systems just to more complicated and interesting designs. I would like to emphasize though that like the fact that we can't see a path to like scaling the design is exactly why you'd want to automate the design process. Use evolutionary algorithm, just figure it out on your own. I don't care how you do it. We'll give you like all the time in the world. Just get a robot that does my dishes somehow or something more complicated.
Yeah. So just like in terms of the behaviors you're able to evolve, and then that you were able to transfer. So it seems like you got quite far, right? Because you could have these things move, but also you managed to get them to manipulate some objects as well. That's correct, right?
Yeah, we got them to. It depends. We didn't statistically prove in that paper that we transferred anything beyond locomotion. In simulation and in vivo, we called it, which is like in life, or in vitro, whatever you want to say, in the little petri dish. In silico and in vitro, we showed kind of separately that these behaviors happen. There is like a spontaneous cleaning of the dish that these things will do. If you put a swarm of the xenobots in a dish and you sprinkle the dish with like little pellets or dye particles, just by their movement alone, or maybe they're smarter than we think. I don't know. Whatever the reason is, they push that debris into like centralized piles in their dish. They like cleaning to anthropomorphize them a little bit. We see that in simulation as well, and we don't need to simulate anything like this desire to clean. This can be done just by morphology and and certain kinds of movements. We also did explicitly evolve in simulation the virtual organisms to push objects. And what happened in simulation is they evolved little like end effectors. It kind of makes sense, like just something to keep that ball in place as they push it, like a little bulldozer. I think Doug might have built some of these in reality, but we didn't prove rigorously that we transferred anything more than locomotion in a straight line for now. We have some unpublished work that should be out soon in which we show some more sophisticated behaviors like swimming instead of just walking. I could talk a little bit about how that's done if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be great.
So the walking organisms, to make them walk, we actually had to remove cilia. Cilia is like these little hairs, these little waving hairs that some microorganisms use to move.
Yeah.
That function in a frog, though, cilia in a frog is used to like move mucus through its skin. It's not used for movement. It's not used for movement in tadpole either. It's just something that cells have. But when you take the cells from a frog embryo and you put them in that dimple in the petri dish, they form a sphere. That sphere actually grows cilia naturally. And so you have a ball. There's this like whoosh balls or something, these like hairy ball, whatever it is. It's like a sphere with a bunch of hairs on it that wiggle, and they can swim using it.
Yeah.
We saw that initially and we were like, we have no idea how to transfer swimming behavior. It seems completely unpredictable. It seems like two morphologies that are identical can swim in completely different ways. The cilia might be changing. Sometimes they just change direction that the cilia are beating. Okay, here's a way to think about the cilia is just like a paddle, like a rower in a boat. And so they're rowing in like different directions. So what we did in our first paper was actually we took the cilia off. There's some like some kind of drug or some kind of a process that can be done in the beginning that inhibits any cilia from growing. So now when you have a sphere of a xenobot sphere, it doesn't move. It just sits on the bottom. And so with that, the only way to move, if you're using heart cells and skin cells, is something that pushes off the dish. And that is something that is much more dependent on geometry and tissue placement. So that was a much better candidate for transferring from sim to real, or sim to life, as I like to call it. That said, in a second paper that should be coming out soon, we left the cilia on. And so just the balls of skin can swim. And now we didn't prove, though, that we can design their behavior by computers necessarily. We took more of a bottom-up approach in the second paper just to see what would kind of emerge. There's all kinds of interesting functionality that once that's published, I'd be happy to come back on and talk about. But I will say that we were able to enhance a little bit this piling behavior in the swimming organisms. So we have no idea how to simulate swimming, how to predict the behavior of a swimming sphere in simulation, but we can predict how they make piles and how the shape of their body will interact with things in the environment to build bigger or smaller piles. So I thought that was kind of an interesting to be published result.
Wait, so sorry, when you say piles, wait, you just mean like the agglomeration of the different types of cells?
So I mean that they are spheres made of cells, and then in the environment there's just trash. There's like dye particles. We put silicone coated iron beads or something, just random things in the dish, and they just kind of clean up the dish. They push those aside, or they build a pile, or whatever they do with it. You can ask the computer to build a really good bulldozer. and we find that actually it seems like that is predictable. We'll see. It's going to take a little bit more more statistics to prove that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to pass it.
Okay, pass it on to me. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, no, I think I was just, I guess your objective here was, and in your previous paper was like you could validate that locomotion was transferable, and now I guess the motivation is to show swimming could potentially be transferable. What is like? How do you choose these objective functions to work towards? Like, why are those important? Um, yeah,
I think there's two reasons. One is that that's what's available to us. Like that's the lowest hanging fruit. They naturally swim. So how can we program the way that they're swimming? How persuadable are they?
right.
At first we thought it wasn't very persuadable. So we removed the cilia and we put in things that we thought were more controllable. But I think that, sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Or I guess like I guess what other functions are in scope
I
that you
remember
don't
that.
even know of, and just like why isn't
Yeah.
something like I wanted to do a specific, I don't know, whatever it is that I'm not aware of as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, sorry. So yeah, I wanted to say that there were 2 points. One is what's available to us, and the other one is I do think that movement is a really crucial capability. If you, for intelligent behavior just in general, also obviously for robots, it's hard to imagine a robot that's useful that doesn't move. So it seems natural that the first thing you're going to teach it to do is to be able to move and to be able to program its movement.
Right.
I also think from a pure AI perspective that movement is the like driving factor for intelligence. Something that doesn't move doesn't need a brain. You don't need to control complicated movement. This is why plants don't have brains. This is why there's something called a sea slug, I think, sea squirt, and it has a
Right.
brain
Yeah.
and it swims. And then the second half of its life, it just attaches itself to a coral reef and becomes basically a plant. And the first thing it does is it eats its own brain. And if that's not evidence that like brains are for movement and everything else that they're used for is like just added on to that, like, okay, you can move through space. Now the world is changing. You need to be able to predict, better about what's going to happen. I think that's, for my opinion, all of intelligence as we know it has evolved on Earth comes from this impetus of moving through an unpredictable world. So that doesn't mean in principle you couldn't build a disembodied AI neural network that's like that is AGI. I'm not saying that. I just think that the only way that we've seen it so far is like grounded in movement and physical embodiment. So why not explore that approach as well?
No, it's
Sure.
obvious. Scraping Reddit posts is going to make AGI. That's coming.
That's true. Maybe.
So I wanted to dig into some more like I guess the applications that were highlighted. Also, I wanted to just preface for people listening. We've been talking a lot about some of the movement in the petri dish and the way that these cells move. Sam has a good video on his YouTube channel of a lecture that he gave at a guest lecture that I think highlights that really well at the beginning. I'd recommend, and maybe if there's other resources I'm missing out on, but recommend people check that out. But I wanted to dig into some of the applications specifically that's been highlighted around the use for microplastics in the ocean or targeted drug delivery and the potential, I guess, downstream use of this work, and wanted to just hear more about that.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why this piling of trash in their debris is more than just intellectually useful is that you could imagine that that's trash in the environment. And one of the things that if you're a microscopic organism, you're not going to be able to like pick up plastic bags, but you can potentially aggregate microplastics, especially the swimming xenobots, if they were in the ocean. Of course, robots that are made of synthetic materials can probably do a lot of these things better than xenobots. They're more programmable. You can program their movement better. You could program a swarm of robots to pick up trash. The problem is that they themselves become more trash because all machines break down and fall apart. And especially in the ocean or something, a robot that's made of plastic itself in salt water is going to add more microplastics to the ocean as it's trying to clean up the macroplastic. So the thing that's interesting for robots built out of biological materials is that biological materials are biocompatible. They're biodegradable. They just kind of fade away and turn into dead skin cells after, if without further bioengineering, like a week and a half, they just disintegrate. But most machines and technologies that we make right now don't do that. They last for thousands of years, and they just have detrimental side effects to the environment, to our health. And that's something that's exciting about kind of building with biology, I think.
So just with regards to the ocean like cleanup application, what does that look like? So would you just have these things like programmed to, like, I don't know, swim in larger and larger radii, and then they have some like chemical in them that makes them biodegrade when they hit a microplastic? Like, could you comment on like how that might work?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think that that's feasible. So once you start moving in 3D, like the space is huge. Maybe something like a river would be a better target. I'm not sure, but let's say that it doesn't necessarily have to find every bit of microplastic and like get rid of it itself. It could just kind of push the microplastics together, just like it pushes the debris together in its own dish now. If you push a bunch of debris together into like a bigger ball
Yeah,
of
then
plastic,
you can kind of clean it up as one shot.
Yeah, then any whatever, a human could come along and pick it up. Another kind of a drone could pick it up. But I think one of the other things that's interesting is that you mentioned is that it doesn't have to be trash. It could be something inside of an animal or in a human. You can't send metal robots inside of a human for very long. The human our immune systems just detest even really tiny bits of metal for good reason. Metals are toxic to biological creatures, most of them. So having something that is roughly programmable, that can do whatever, even in the bare minimum of just scraping things or piling things, that could be useful in medical applications or in environmental cleanup jobs like this, I think. Even if it doesn't have to zap particles of interest, or maybe that's possible, I don't know how, but even simple movements to compile things into a big ball of plastic or to scrape plaque off of arteries, these are things that really simple xenobots could already potentially do.
For sure. And I was wondering, like, your work now, how do you and your team think about these applications with industry collaborators or whoever would be the ones who would probably be leading? I mean, maybe it's your team as well, but I'm just wondering, is there an industry focus that you're collaborating with as a group as well?
There's been a lot of interest. This is still super basic science. I do feel strongly that you could have really simple xenobots doing useful work. I don't think they have to be much more sophisticated. I do think this could go to industry. Now, you don't want to put frog cells inside of a human either. You don't want to put metal in there. You don't want to put, so like this would probably have to be made out of patient's own cells. And so there's still work to be done and ethical considerations about this kind of thing. But I do think that just swirling around swarms of xenobots that just swirl around and scrape, calcium deposits or plaque or whatever, or pile plastic, I do think there are applications for that. There has been interest. It's obviously very basic science at the moment, and like the bringing something from science to industry is incredibly difficult, even if it seems like it's very close to being there. To make it profitable, that's totally outside my expertise. I mean, people have been interested, like I said, but no one has bought the rights yet. Reach out to me if you want to for some of my scientific research. Yeah, I'd be happy to work with other people to bring this to market. And the more sophisticated xenobots that actually zap things, that might be 50, 100 years off. But the simple ones that are useful, I don't see any reason why that couldn't be done in the next decade.
For sure. And I guess like you commented a bit on the ethical considerations, and I imagine that the policy work, the governance structures, and the legal and ethical frameworks must be something maybe it's out of scope of what you think about and work with, but I'd imagine would also be a big burden to seeing this being used in industry. I think there's probably a group of people who are thinking like, I don't want a robot in my body. Like that's probably like the, you know, maybe the saying or whatever it is. And I just
Yeah.
wanted to know your thoughts on that type of potential bottleneck, or maybe you don't think it's a bottleneck to seeing how it's deployed.
No, I think that even if we don't think that there are ethical concerns in certain spaces, we should try really hard to think about what they could be.
Yeah,
Now, especially when the technology is really simple, I can see a number of different concerns that may or may not be of interest. There is like where the cells come from. So this is animal research. Now, like I said, this is a day-old embryo from a frog. Frogs lay thousands of eggs, a week. No way most of those are surviving in the wild. Like the mom frog eats half of them or something, and they just, but it has the potential to turn into a frog. So you have to ask yourself, it's like a trolley car problem or something. Like you're pulling the lever. Do you decide to make this into a bot and to deny it of? I mean, if you eat animals for food,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you can really say much here. That being said, even for whatever these ethical concerns are, and there are other ones, like you said, about unleashing these things into the environment, whatever, you have to weigh the pros and the cons. All technologies can be dangerous. Fire can kill people, but if we don't have fire, everyone's dying of cholera. So, the internet can be really bad as well, but it can also be really good. So I do think that probably somewhere along the line, there's going to be an economic reason for biological robots. So we should try to figure out now how to best control them and avoid some of these bad situations, like
for sure.
gray goo or something. Like let's figure this out now before it's a serious immediate concern.
And then just like on that, another thing that I think you commented about before was in another talk was like this self-replication aspect, which it could also be a concern, right? Like if you have them self-replicating, well, where does it stop? So first of all, like, is that actually a feasible thing to be able to do? And second of all, do you think like we would want them to be able to do that or not?
I think that's a question for everyone. Right now, they can't reproduce, but
yeah,
you ever watch Jurassic Park? It's like life finds a way. Whatever Jeff Goldblum's character says that, and it's true. Like maybe it was actually that they weren't supposed to be able to reproduce, or they weren't supposed to be able to evolve, or whatever it was with the dinosaurs. Life finds a way.
But like you're not doing DNA modifications right now, at least to these.
We're not. So yeah, so there's other ethical concerns with biotechnology in general that I think place xenobots kind of like low.
Yeah,
on the
that's
list
a
to
good
worry
point
about,
as well. Yeah,
is that these are 100% frog DNA. We're not introducing some new like species into the world. Well, first of all, they're all inside of a lab and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And no one's allowed to eat them. There's like strict animal guidelines, animal welfare guidelines and everything. And the frogs that lay the eggs, they live a good life, I think. These things are all taken into consideration. But yeah, so these cells cannot reproduce in the traditional way of dividing and growing more blobs. When you disassociate the cells from the embryo, they basically, all they can do is stick together and differentiate into heart or cilia or whatever. But we should think about ways in which replication could be possible, because that could be something dangerous. It also could be something really useful if we could control it.
Yeah, because it definitely seems like I actually wasn't asking it in the way of like, oh, that would be really scary. Like I'm very like technologically progressive, I guess. Like I think if we could have like it, if you told me tomorrow we'd have these things reproduce and like do what you were talking about earlier, like herding the plastic in the ocean into one location, I think that's definitely a trade you should take, as long as they don't keep reproducing forever and take over the whole ocean. But yeah, like it's really interesting to think about kind of the trade-offs, or maybe even not the trade-offs of that.
Yeah, I wanted to also just dig in, like you commented earlier, like people trying to find ways to take it to market or build a community around like this research. How popular is this research in the like how many people are like working on these types of problems globally? Is there like yeah, I'm just curious to know like how big is this group of people in this space?
Well, I don't know yet. At the moment, there's only one team that makes computer designed organisms. But there could be more now. I hope that it's a lot more, and I hope like a diversity of minds start working on this problem, because like our view is probably very narrow here. That said, there's nothing really special about this. Like I said, Doug is like an incredible microsurgeon, but there are lots of people in the world that could do that or build a technology to automate it. The instructions for the code are open source. The instructions for building this are open source. You can actually order frog embryos. I think we have a link for a website in the paper even. Like you can order the materials. You can do this yourself. You have to have some skill, but there's nothing stopping other people from doing it. And I hope that helps other people reproduce this and improve upon our work. But yeah, at the moment, there's only the xenobots are the only computer designed organism species, but I hope that lots more are born soon.
Yeah, and I noticed in all of your papers that where you have results, like you have the GitHub available, and that you're able to find ways for people who want to reproduce it to achieve the same like computational results. Is that a priority for you and your team when doing a project? Because like why is reproducibility important for you? Because it is a big problem in many other areas of machine learning. Yeah.
Well, I think if it's not reproducible, then I would argue it's not science. I mean, if you can just do it once, I don't know. And something works for us, it likely is a bug in our code somewhere. The temperature was like a certain thing, and the xenobots only move in like the lab at Tufts, but then you build it somewhere else. We don't know what these things are, so it needs to be reproduced by a lot of people. I feel really confident in this result, like more than most of my work, because it's not dependent on the specific algorithm that I use. There's not like some fitness curve or loss curve that's slightly significantly different from another one. And if there was a bug or if there was something in the simulation, the fact that we transferred this to reality, I feel like this result is secure, but you never know. Like until it gets in a textbook, like 10 years later.
For sure, I agree with that, right? Especially in robotics, where you do a lot of stuff in simulation, and I've worked a bit on sim to real as well in some of my own stuff. And like when you actually get something to work in real life, that's the best feeling, because like that's not because you set some friction constant wrong or something. That's just like that's hard truth, I guess.
Yeah. And I was reading more a bit about, some of the conferences, like I don't know if the acronym I'm saying it right, Gecko, is that what it's called? And VCO as well. Yep. It's creating opportunities for people to learn more about this work. Have you noticed that those types of events and opportunities have made a difference to people competing in the space? Have there been really good contributions to this space from those events?
So the Xenobot and computer designed organisms are new, but we've definitely seen new kinds of people become interested in this field of like evolutionary robotics. So you don't need to be evolving an organism. You can evolve a robot made of anything, cells or metal or soft stuff. A lot of my work, or all of my work up until this point, was evolving soft robots, and we were trying to build them out of like silicone elastomer, like pneumatically actuated material. The interest in evolutionary robotics was somewhat small. Could probably count on one hand, like the number of people that are evolutionary would call themselves evolutionary roboticists, and like how many people say they do deep learning. You'd need like that count would never end.
You need quite a large number of bits to store that, not one hand.
Totally. So I think like there have been people reaching out that saying, I saw Xenobot, and this is the best kind of email that I ever get. Like, I saw Xenobots and I know, like, I want to do this research. How do I do it? And what they're really saying isn't necessarily about the fact that their organisms are made of biological materials. They're interested in evolutionary robotics, which is great. So this is a way to get people interested in this kind of larger field of just automating the design and manufacture of robots or whatever it is. So that's been really exciting for me. There has been significant media attention that I was not ready for at all. Like this paper, I knew it was coming out in January, and I spent all of December, I was like building a new physics engine. And I forget exactly what I was working on. And all of a sudden the paper hit and everyone's calling me up, asking me about this project. And I was like, I forget what we did. Like, this was 2 months ago. Let me think. It was overwhelming, but it's great. Obviously, you want people to care about it.
I think definitely Shrey can relate to some of the media stuff because he and I had like a project that blew up kind of last year at the like related to coronavirus, and it can be
boom. It just it's fun though. Yeah, and I guess like one of the things I was thinking about doing, even like you have like I think it's on Voxcraft website, like you can literally get all the links to all the parts that you want to do to build a voxel. And I think you've created a really great documentation around how to kind of do this stuff on your own. Why do you spend time to creating that type of platforms for people? It's really amazing. I guess I just like, why is it of value to you to spend time in creating that type of content as well?
Well, I think even the documentation can be improved further. And by creating something that's open source, I hope that other people contribute to it and make it better, including the documentation. It's really important for the reasons we discussed. Like, you want people to be able to reproduce your work, to improve upon it. You want more minds thinking about the problems that you feel are interesting. And no one is getting past, I actually was looking at my own websites recently. I was like, people are not going to get past the first line. It needs to be, you can click a button and it works. Because if they spend, especially nowadays, our attention spans are so short. We expect to get things running on our computer within like a minute.
Yeah.
If you have to read, and my code from the Xenobots paper is the worst because you have to revert you have to revert these packages back. Like, they don't work after things were upgraded, and it's all reproducible, but you have to follow this list of instructions, and people aren't willing to do that anymore. So we're trying to build software and have software being up to date and developed and on GPUs and using the best and modern technology, because it helps us build better things and do faster and better science. But yeah, just to get more people thinking about this. And it is like a self-referential thing. They also contribute and make it clearer and better. So if we can just get that like feedback started, then I can stop doing so much work, let everyone else do it.
Yeah, for sure. And I imagine like having that GPU simulator is really speeds things up, because I know in some, like I've also switched to using not Voxcraft, like more traditional robotics, but GPU acceleration. It makes a very big difference. Yeah, so I was just going to ask, so you're making these, you're also providing, I guess, the materials for these kits that people can make these silicon-based robots out of, which are like bigger. They use compressed air instead of like heart tissue to do like the contraction. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of those versus the biological ones? And do they have potential applications for those as well?
Yeah, I think the story of those is also kind of funny. Like, that also was something in which in simulation, there aren't actually literally voxels. I was talking about this in the beginning and I thought maybe it was too technical, but I'm glad that I mentioned it. The voxels are actually simulated by like two voxels together, just have one beam from center point to center point, and it can act like a piston. It's visualized as voxels because there's other reasons it's visualized as voxels, like the collisions are somewhat like voxels and other things. but there are no voxels. There is no spoon or whatever. There are no voxels. And then the lab at Yale saw our videos of our simulations and thought, I can build voxels, and literally built voxels. And they were
Right.
literal cubes, thin walls of silicone, but like hollow on the inside, like a
Right.
balloon. So it was different than the simulation, but like embodied the same, something
Yeah.
similar from it. And the question was, can we actually transfer behavior? The important thing is transferring behavior. You can build it out of whatever you want. It can look like whatever you want. It doesn't have to look the same. But if the behavior in simulation matches the behavior in reality, then you're doing it right.
Mhm.
There's still a lot of work to be done actually in the silicone elastomer voxel robots to transfer interesting kinds of behaviors.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons you might want to use silicone instead of living material is that the xenobots at the moment are microscopic,
Yeah.
and they can't push like a tennis ball or something. Like they can't do useful
Yeah.
things on size scales that are larger than them at the moment.
Mhm.
So the silicone robots are larger. That said, we're trying to figure out how to make them smaller, but not that much smaller, like
Yeah.
centimeter scale. And they are pneumatics, so
Yeah.
it's with air. That's tricky for a number of reasons, to like get enough force that actually pushes this thing and moves it.
Yeah.
It's fun though, because it is something that anyone could do. I was trying to like assign an age to this, like, and I think any kid could do it, like ages 12 and up. I don't know what it is. It's more about like, do they have the attention span? Because I think anyone could do this. It's just like
Yeah.
whether or not they'd want to.
How are you
Because
doing the actual, like, because you said it's pneumatic, so how are you, like, do you have a compressor or something like that, and then how is the control working with it?
So I think like a kid could actually just, and this is what we do, and initially was just like a syringe with air. Like you could just pump it
Oh,
with your hand.
yeah, that's really interesting.
So this could be like a really lame Lego set that just jiggles across the table. We're trying to make it like more, we're trying to make the simplest cases like more dynamic. So it could be something like to use as a soft robot design and construction kit, maybe for the classroom or something. But in terms of like the more scientific work with this, there are systems that we're building to have like automated control and more power and higher pressure, and faster actuation. And the control system then would be something like, when do we inflate each one of the voxels? Or maybe you could simplify it and say that there are the entire thing, all of the voxels have holes poked in between them. They're just like balloons, basically.
Yeah.
The whole thing then becomes a single actuator. You're building it out of voxels,
Yeah.
but they're all internally connected. So in
Yeah.
the end, you have like a Minecraft thing that just expands and contracts. Like, can you get that thing to move? It becomes a similar question to like the xenobots from the morphology side. But you can do a little bit more fine-tuned control of like, one voxel inflates and then the one next to it inflates and the one next to it inflates, or there's a neural network that says, here's how all of the voxels will inflate based off of sensory information. Like you could put sensors on, we're working on this now, like sensorizing the voxels. So not just making hollow cubes out of silicone, but putting electronics on the side that are stretchable.
Yeah.
So when it touches the ground, that might trigger it's
Oh,
going to
wow. Yeah, that's
sound
so cool.
complex and cool, but in the end, it's still going to be a shuffling little blob. So, like
And
this is not going to replace robot arms, but
this is like, seems like a very easy go-to-market strategy for a startup, get acquired by Lego, and there you go. But it's really cool. Like it's just a different, like, I feel like it could be really, I mean, I personally am planning on trying it sometime soon, so I'll keep you posted on that as well. So I wanted to also just like at a high level, what are the biggest bottlenecks that you're facing right now in your research? And maybe like, are you tackling them, or is it something like it's just out of scope to tackle right now? Like, what are the biggest challenges right now?
Money. No, if I could have whatever I wanted, I would hire the game development team that makes like StarCraft or something. I'd be like, help me improve this GPU simulator that I have, or maybe you want to make one from scratch, and it doesn't have to have voxels, whatever. It can have whatever you want, but we're going to need to make this highly parallelized, super fast, soft-bodied physics engine that we can simulate swarms of xenobots in, and design them and do it as fast as possible. If you gave me some budget, I would spend most of it on that, and then like maybe one ML engineer. Like I think most of it, but I'm biased, but like I would spend most of it on the physics engine team.
Yeah.
There are tons of opportunity. There's tons of bottlenecks in which there's manual things, and like all kinds of engineers would be useful in automating how the simulator is tuned according to the real dynamics, like the system identification kind of thing. I think that like this design side, you could do more sophisticated machine learning techniques, maybe, to come up with a better diversity and better fine tuning in simulation. But again, that won't matter if there's not a correspondence between sim to real. So maybe my ordering of importance would be like super awesome simulator, a team for real to sim transfer.
Right.
Yeah.
Like one engineer. I don't know how many people I am at this point, but yeah, it would be just improving these design components. And then there's a bottleneck of building them. So can we automate the manufacture? And does that mean 1,000 like bioprinters in a line? Like there's a conveyor belt and the eggs are coming down and like being disassembled. I don't know. But automating this, I think all the pieces that are manual are the bottleneck right now. I envision this completely automated pipeline that all you say is, here are the materials we're building with. This cell goes like this, it contracts, this cell swims, this cell can sense light. I want this thing to find cancer or whatever, I don't know what it is, some behavioral goal and some building blocks, go to work, spit out the organism at the other end. And if it doesn't work like you thought it would, update the simulator and restart. So I just press a button and walk away. That's
yeah, that sounds real. I think I was seeing like some talk from Andrei Koropathy, who's like one of the AI like leads at Tesla, I think, and he was saying that they have like an automated loop of the machine learning that goes into the Tesla stuff. So it sounds like you're trying to do a similar thing. That kind of scares me.
Give me
like automated loop going into your car. But in terms of like you're talking about the real to sim thing, have you seen some of this? I presume you have, but the stuff around like Bayesian like parameter identification, so like where you use like randomization in the simulator, but then you see how it performs in real life, and then through that you kind of figure out what the parameters were, I guess. Is that kind of what you're talking about when you say like real to sim?
Yeah, I think that would be a great next step for trying to automate this. So we have like some priors in there, and maybe that comes from us, or maybe they're random. I don't know what it is, but some system for updating where the simulator is randomized, where it's not. I also think that you can do more than that. I think that you can probably learn not just the dynamics of a fixed system, but you could change the system itself. Like you could add more elements that weren't in the system to begin with. Maybe that can be considered under Bayesian framework. I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic to what you call it, but ideally what we would want is the most flexibility. So this system is really moldable, and based off of what's happening in reality, it can update it to improve sim to real transfer.
So like a learning simulator almost.
Yeah. I've seen some things. So like, okay, you could ask me the question, is a physics simulator even necessary? Like, could that be replaced by a neural network?
Yeah.
I guess so. if there's no humans in the loop, like looking at the design and verifying all these different parts and like reading
Yeah.
out the blueprint, if it's all a machine, then yeah, I guess I would imagine that the first things the deep neural network learns is like laws of physics, but who
Yeah.
knows? Like those things work in mysterious ways. So
Yeah, because like I've seen there's like some work around using like neural networks to predict the solutions of like differential equations and stuff, and like they'll solve a weather system, for example, 1,000 times faster than, you know, classical physics simulators. So yeah, maybe you can do a similar thing with the voxels. Yeah, that's really awesome. So I guess like moving on to some kind of I don't know what we would call this, like um personal questions or like question about you. So like I guess one of these that we kind of like to ask all of our guests is like, what do you think you understand really well that has led you to kind of down this path of research, or what do you do differently than other people that has allowed you to this like really unique research into these at this kind of intersection of disciplines?
I think that's something that I might appreciate that a lot of people in AI don't, is the role of the body in intelligence. And that has led me down the path of trying to prove that there are systems in which no matter how complex and amazing the controller is, the body is not going to let you do it. Most people agree with that. They see the body as a constraint that needs to be overcome. And if you do, that's amazing. You got it to work in a robot, even though this is so difficult. But I would like to show with my research that actually the body can enhance the behavior. It can be something that actually facilitates adaptive behavior and intelligence. And so my, I guess, appreciation of like embodied cognition literature, I mean, honestly, maybe my best virtue is my laziness. Like, don't read the literature, just decide what you want to do. And if you read too much of the literature
Yeah.
and of what you think you're good at or bad at, and it's going to stop you from doing things, just like try to do something that people think is crazy. And then in hindsight, go back and see where it fits in with the literature. It's unlikely. I mean, if you're doing neural network like optimization of what should layer like 13 be in this deep neural network, probably someone's done it before.
Yeah.
But if you're doing something like crazy enough, it's going to be
Qualitatively
novel.
new.
Don't
Yeah.
worry about like whether or not it's possible. Just try to do it. I don't know if I have any special skills. I think there are people in the world that can make a better physics simulator than me. There's people in the world that can do a better evolutionary algorithm, that can whatever, make better figures and write a better paper. It's just about deciding like what you want to spend your time on.
For sure. Yeah. No, and our last question for today was around, what does like I guess for me, like I don't have a bio background. Like I'm taking my first bio course in university right now. But it almost seems as though from an outsider, this field seems very bio intense. But as we're through a conversation today, like what you need most is people who can develop, a physics engine and an ML engineer. What do people who might want to dive into the space need to know as a prerequisite, maybe before they can start being of value to maybe your team or people in the space as well?
Well, so that's what I say. If you ask the biologists, they'd probably tell you that we need to know all this. We need all of this money for biology. There's a lot of stuff we don't know about how biological systems work. I think that AI can help us uncover those things. So we don't need to just use this system as an engineering tool. It could be used as a scientific tool. You could say, okay, instead of, I want this pipeline to output systems that are good at this behavior that I think is useful work, like carrying an object, you could say, output systems that like are very transparent. They make things that are difficult to investigate in frogs easier to see. And the pipeline spits out these weird shapes of cells, and it helps people figure out how cells work or how cancer works or something. Like these are things that I think that this system could be used for. If people are interested in this, I think that this is a growing field. Just that you look at the trend in AI, like it started out as recognizing images, recognizing digits, recognizing whatever, like what are these things? and it's moved, at least in my opinion, to generating new images, deep fakes, a lot of the autonomous robots in some cases. This is just another example of this, in which it's an artificial but entirely biological system, and it opens up some new interesting questions. But there's nothing that I think all the same things that you would want to have skill with as an ML engineer would be useful, whether or not you're automating the design of a neural network or of a robot or an organism. I think the big thing is just to broaden the scope, I think, of what traditionally ML is concerned with is neural network software, because like we say, learning seems like learning is being good at chess or these games or math or whatever. I think trying to get more ML people interested in robotics would be a good start.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think, yeah, me and Arthur always talk a lot about how can we drive progress, and like we're always interested in hearing from people like yourselves, like what can people like in our community be doing as well. I want to just try to provide a brief summary for the audience. It's like what we talked about today, and if at any time I like maybe miss something important, don't hesitate to like add on to me. But we started off the conversation just really diving into what virtual creatures are, how they're created, some of the motivation and history behind them. We then kind of dove into talking about voxels and how they're created. And we ended up diving into both how they're created in the biological setting, but also in this like silicon setting, which if anyone's interested can actually go on the website and create if you order all the Amazon parts on your own. We dove really deep into the xenobots, which was really interesting and was really exciting. And not only just the biology behind it, but some of the applications and some of the limitations into what they can be applied to. And of course, naturally talked a bit about the ethical considerations that may be needed for their widespread deployment, and talking a bit more about the bottlenecks that your team is facing and maybe things that people who want to dive into the space can decide to learn more about, and how important it is for when you're doing research, keep in mind about reproducibility, educating others. And if you open source it, maybe that yields an opportunity for continuous feedback loops for you and your team to be more clean and more productive with your work. If I missed anything there, don't hesitate to chime in, but I think it's been just an amazing conversation to learn from you. And we really appreciate your time to be on our show today.
Thank you. That was an excellent summary. I don't think you need me. That was good.
Yeah, and thanks so much for coming on. And we'll be sure to link all of your like your site and your Twitter, as well as the materials. The materials that you referenced, like the voxel craft, the Xenobots website, and everything in the show notes or in the description on YouTube, so that everyone can go and check those out, because it's really amazing work. And I would encourage you to dive in as we have, because we really enjoyed it. All right. Thanks for everyone for